Hello everyone, today we talk about Urartian, Transcaucasian and Cimmerian warfare. We are in the first millennium BC. I decided to start talking a little bit introductively about the main eras of essentially Western Eurasian steppes or whereabouts warfare, given that you seem to appreciate particularly this times and spaces. We will arrive likely up to the modern age in the process, so looking at this different the alternation in these spaces of various peoples, and outlining their major military characteristics, right? You know that I make other series. This is actually bit an off-track one. You probably noticed that every once in a while I dare getting out of the cycle, like a bit Caesar, getting out of the res publica and, devoting myself to Fortuna, mother and daughter gods, and trying to represent the golden age after the sacrilege of the infringement of the Sibylline books and all these kind of things, to bring Schwerpunkt back on the right tracks, right? From our fallen background, right? And you would be probably unsurprised by his point, at least if you're a regular follower, to hear that most of the mentality of these populations here literally revolved around this kind of thinking. We're looking at essentially times and spaces very different, definitely from mostly, at least for the one of time, of course, unless there is some kind of reincarnation process that, however, is again Apollonian tradition. Actually, is a superstitious cult of some sort, and it works just for the damned. But as far also as spaces, maybe we'll bring more, audience from the countries of the modern states that own these lands. In any case, what I would like to stress, as always, is the mental, cultural distance, right? We're talking about extremely unmodern and unsecular realities. Not all of them, right? For example, the Urartians here are a bit sort of middlemen of civilization. They would become essentially an Assyrian client state. But on the main team, yes, the steppes, and also the closer one, the Western Eurasian ones, we will focus more on the most. That we will stretch a bit more eastwards, and you know that. In fact, I make other videos of this kind. Are quite fascinating because they highlight the contrast between, in fact, in the point of joint and of attrition and friction between the wild steppes kind of and the civilized plains in a way, and in ways, by the way, we can document, right? The reason why we know more about Western Eurasian steppes warfare is that tendentially the West began to document our history, and in a more, in fact, relatable way, but just providing with actually larger amounts of information and saying what the Chinese did, at least for what survived, but also properly in the methods, in the level of critique, of insight, of analysis, and so on, right? But this is part of a huge space that these peoples were capable of crossing relatively quickly, right? Sometimes we tend to reason in this kind of fashion that unfortunately is quite incorrect, right? The entire concept of geopolitics as such, and especially in the way it's used, is practically rubbish to carry out any political strategic analysis worth of this name. It's not just a big word that ungrown children use, thinking to mimic men and or at least competent people, and the fluidity of the steppes is in this sense quite telling, because definitely there is an environmental, territorial influence that allows to trace specific patterns. There are some territories that are better rewards for certain type of lifestyle, which reflects some times of of politics and warfare. However, times change, right? What I must confess, I haven't began my studies or even just specialized specifically on steppes warfare, so I'm distant from that reality. I'm a completely gentrified and lazy, soft, spoiled scholar who just looks mostly at this from his Western-centered perspective. But for this very reason, every time I look at the steppes, I realize how, first of all, in this sense, truly important the history of Western civilization, also in sedentary terms, really is. How overlooked, right, and underappreciated. You would say, how? Yes, exactly this, right? Because what emerges from the steppes is a dramatic situation that highlights beautifully the continuous contrast, kind of erosion, power struggle that is much more truly brutal than what you see in sedentary civilizations, to the point that things must occur without much of a surplus, without much of a, even with a more restricted choice in some ways, just relatively connected to it. I made that video about Mongolian logistics, where when you realize that in order to move armies and essentially herds of hundreds of thousands, not just of men, but mostly horses, right? You can't just do this whenever you like. Basically, there is only one way, right? There's just a major valley that you must cross just in that specific season when there is enough water, staying close to the river. So this would, like in the enormous steppes space that naturally is very variegated, also from a climatological point of view, really in terms of terrain, of weather and so on, of landscape. Literally, there are so many different things in the steppes, but that in this sense we're seen, right, and studying the history of these peoples. In fact, we're seen by them as extremely telling about what much more conclusive about the political possibilities that you normally have and that you can fundamentally enact if you only are minimally forced, right, to move 1 millimeter away from your comfort zone, and if you're willing to undertake something serious that is essentially based on the idea of becoming the better self of yours, which is a bit basically the only value of mankind, right? A person who is satisfied with him or herself, basically, what's the point of them living, right? I don't really understand that. And that these peoples, in fact, incarnated a bit in their own mentality, in their own lifestyle, in their mythology we can study, and so on. So it's actually always the same power struggle with much less extra grips, as a matter of fact, if not for some extraordinary, for example, metallurgical skills, this enormous, in fact, logistical capacities that are typical of steppes peoples, and that made them, exactly because of this compressed, may seem strange to talk so claustrophobically about such a wide open agoraphobia triggering an enormously so space like the steppe. But so it was, really, to a point that makes you understand better how lucky you are, right? Not just to live in the current time, but what a huge difference really such context really made, right? And especially in the frontier areas that we will analyze, because we will not look just at nomadic peoples, as you understand, even just from the list that I gave you here. We're looking at Caucasian, Transcaucasian, so mostly sedentaries. But even in the relation, of course, with the steppes, how to cope, right, politically, strategically, and what kind of with these challenges, and what it means to dimension the value of a civilization, right? There is no doubt, again, that the steppe is truly barbarian, is brutal, is wild, is savage, is underdeveloped. But this doesn't mean that in its primitiveness there is nothing that civilization could make use of, right? And also being afraid of, because really civilization takes much greater energies, because it's a truly much more qualitative thing than what is constantly out there as a sort of a perpetually eroding system that evidently doesn't have the means to truly dominate the sanitary world, because this is basically what emerges from all these stories, that the only way for these peoples to rule over a sanitary reality was becoming sedentaries, and de facto basically having an elite ruling in, over largely a culture, a country people that is sedentary, right? This is the entire history of the migration era, where like the Huns could have never conquered Europe, nor the Mongols could have ever conquered Europe, because objectively they didn't have the tools for doing that, right? You could at best have some elites of them could settle in some other areas, like it's in China. Later on, you have India, you have, say, a Central Asian world that can every once in a while send this kind of, tipping the balance, right, by knocking out the current dynasty, installing themselves, however, in a system that was either, in fact, Persian or Chinese or whatever, not really, while the steps remain the steps. And this is a very bitter thing to say, because objectively, yeah, that's the case. That's the case even in closer places of nomadic areas. Think about North Africa or Arabia or Mongolia, right? History wasn't kind with these areas, because objectively there was not much that they could produce just out of themselves. This is what makes it all the more interesting to evaluate actually the dramatic effort that these peoples were able to bring with them, and observing that at least the greater victory of the steppes lays in a universal forma mentis, which is essentially imperial and traditional in nature. That is to say, as Europeans, we are so because of these nomadic peoples, because in times which, such as the Bronze Age, in which Europe already had a sanitary civilization, but nomadic peoples that managed to instill, right, in our culture, in our tradition, in our mythology, in our properly in our cognitive system, their own worldview. We still speak the language of the celestial, the heavenly derived sounds. All our in European languages, the phonetics correspond specifically to an onomatopoeic metaphor, let's say, of the skies, of the sun. I will make videos. It's from a while that I say it now. I should make it one for real. But the idea of the night, right? It's something deeply ingrained already in all the sanitarized Greeks, Germans, Celts, Romans, whatever, because their culture all stemmed from the Caucasian steppes, and Europe keeps, especially in Central Eastern Europe, receiving these waves of people. So surely weren't quite beneficial to the local development, because those would remain, and still are, in large part, the least developed areas in Europe, but would still confer to the Westerners that kind of, exercise, let's put it in this way, that kind of backbone, that kind of awareness, that kind of confrontation that would make us grow to essentially the dominant global civilization, the truly the imperial one, one of these peoples whose blood really runs in our veins, whether we like it or not, really truly believe to the most. And all our religions, from what we call paganism in the past, or Catholicism, or properly the entire concept of the imperial, universal, ecumenic tradition, is all there. It's arguably there also for other peoples, because you can never distinguish fully when, at some point we were old nomads, right? And so when these religions were created, and of course they connected, as you know, this all from a fall, from a divine origin, so something that would be interesting to really look at more seriously, because even by ruling that out, if you actually read, learn, study tradition, you realize that this stuff matches up, right? Neurobiologically, just behaviorally, psychologically, archetypally, anthropologically, in everything to what we are discovering scientifically, right? So it's something that really makes you reevaluate the entire meaning, right, of this world. And Wu's belief was essentially the ideal of struggle and victory, right? And that we know, evolutionarily speaking, being at the deepest root of our genes, that the idea that our meaning is conflictual, that there is nothing that we can do without sacrificing something. So going the other direction just means going towards the denial of mankind, which is, of course, what kind of the more the decay of tradition from, again, the imperial universalism, and so the right of the strongest to rule on the weaker on a global scale because of the moral superiority, right, of the stronger, truly not the brutality of it. It's in fact something that's been completely flipped over, and with a huge process of mass systematic elimination, canceling, etc., of all what was properly the real tradition, so much so that even those would allegedly claim to be traditionalists actually buy into the nationalist and or socialist ideological delusion of it, that is for fourth estate or lesser people. But they do not know that, exactly because they are exactly that, right? So studying the history of these people is a way to come closer also to that kind of awareness about the role, the dramatic importance of the connection between politics and the exercise of violence, which gets down not to barbarism, to tribalism, in fact, of the lesser forms of the peoples who never conquered and ruled, and everyone, like most of these peoples would never be able to take over the greater civilizations of the sanitary world, and that is a concept thoroughly based on the concept of authority, rationality, order, discipline, so quality, the difference in value of a human being from another, which is exactly what instead is being hysterically denied, even though by those who say, I'm whining because there is an evil dude up there that I don't know, that is controlling the world, and I don't want that. If you cannot challenge that guy in the sense that you cannot be the one who rules the world or doesn't even want that, you essentially just deserve to be there, right? And nobody should be interested in whatever happens to you. And this is actually the literal belief that, so the complete antithesis of all the populistic, conspiratorial, and fundamentally mentally diseased fourth estater subculture. Either, again, it's nationalistic or socialistic, or most of the times it's actually both things at the same time, which is actually the most accurate depiction, because the ultimate step there is communism. It's the idea of being required a certain value just because being a part of a certain group, right? Which means that you, of course, do not have any value whatsoever, which is a splendid realization when you finally can free yourself from it and rejecting all this trash that was not known up to, or truly, it was really believed to be the religion of the lesser people until 200, 300 years ago. But that most kids that also very often come on my videos just because of the ethno-tribalistic content do not understand, because nobody has schooled them. They didn't receive an adequate parental upbringing. They don't know. They don't read. They don't know anything, right? They're living in a world where, of course, they have already lost, essentially. And unfortunately, that's also what we will have to cope with in the future, to levels that will be really impressive, and in part we are already seeing. In any case, to the military side of the story, for these miniseries, I don't know how often I will be uploading this stuff, but it will get down to something really simple in terms of arms and armor, general tactics, general geographic areas, general timeline, just to say what were these people about, and how can we have sort of mental picture of who was who at a given time, a given place, and how they fought and why, right? That from one side, I will probably insert these videos in because that for the playlist I pick different, say, same video for different playlists. In fact, for the Bronze Age one, right? In this case, at least it's something between the boundary between Bronze and Iron Age is somehow blurred. But we will, of course, insert them as a bit of a strengthener, as a gluing, hopefully views catcher for the bigger series that, as you know, get down to covering in hundreds or even thousands of videos every single of these people in detail as far as their army organization, tactics, battles, and military units are concerned, right? And not packed like in these videos that are just child's play in comparison. So yeah, for everything it takes time, but I realize that basic videos sometimes are better than others, at least for getting the bulk of the views, and then for those who want to refine their knowledge, they can step to the kind of more advanced stuff. We start from the Taurus Mountains and ending up to the Taurica Steppes, right? So we are essentially in this crescent that is just minimally overlappable, with the actual fertile crescent, stretching from, say, Anatolia, the Caucasus, North Caucasus, up to the Pontic Steppe. The other day I uploaded a video, as you know, about the Sarmatians. I plan on to discuss them also in this series again. We speak of the Urartians. Some of these peoples are really obscure in terms of their ethnogenesis, right? We can rely, of course, on language, and language is not necessarily genes. As you know, there are some dominant cultures, and especially those nomadic elements from Central Asia that, as we've seen, are a bit like the engine of all this mechanism, also of toughening up the sedentary civilizations, are very often coming in small numbers, either as sometimes lords, rulers. They can even succeed, as we've seen, in establishing ruling dynasties. And they come with military retinues, essentially with an elite outlook, because cavalry, as we will see now, is something new. We are in the age of late, say, chariot warfare at this point. Cavalry technically is already around, but it's not being fully mastered until the Cimmerians in this case, as we will see. And it's mostly a supported arm, a non-decisive one, at least among the cemeteries. Actually, chariot warfare was a thing coming from the same Central Asia, as you know, but eventually the steppes would be the place where, I made a video about this, of course, horsemanship was born in the first place. The domestication of the horse, first as a mean of transportation, then as actually a mean of war. The Urartians can be identified as essentially the closest people to the Armenians that we can at least indicate historically, right, in the region, as with a political, cultural, linguistic unity of sort. They spoke a northern Caucasian language that is somehow similar to, that's cognate to the one of today's Chechens, Inguzes, and the majority of the Dagestani peoples, interestingly enough, being flourishing in the first millennium BC. The origin was surely older, right, likely even up to 4000 BC, but the thing now derails on a linguistic sidebar that I prefer not to touch for today. It's not so important. The important is that we can identify them as a political unit, provided with an important degree of cohesion that is reflected in their warfare. The Urartu found a kingdom on their own, centered on the famous Lake Ban in eastern Anatolia, right? And their power stretches to actually substantially distant areas, such as the ones of today's eastern Turkey, Armenia, and northwestern Iran, right? This power is practically squeezed, as some of basically it's a bit all the history of this region that have a substantial degree of sedentarization as a sedentary peoples, but they are exposed to severe nomadic movements. Right, in the north you have the Caucasus Mountains that are by a degree a bulwark, but that cannot quite be just closed to passage. As we'll see now what their policy was about, you have essentially to garrison the passes, but these are in some of the most difficult areas strategically to control, and the locals will tend also to autonomize themselves and maybe letting the invaders pass to avoid having their objectively less appealing lands in terms of fertility compared to the one of the lowlands just spared. Reason for which that there is also the eastern border, let's say, from which actually most of the peoples that would subdue them at the end of the day, the Iranians, right, would come from, which is the Maids specifically, but mixed again with this consistent amount of steppes element. Again, as a medievalist, I can't fail to notice the similarities with, say, I don't know, the age of the Caliphate and or even just of the more sedentary Iranian powers and the arrival of the Seljuks. Again, it's always this continuous pouring from the steppes that from one side causes political turmoil, regime changes, and so on, but fundamentally also grafts on previous sedentary system, right? As sedentaries, the Urartians fought at least with a numerical prevalence of infantry, right? Infantry that had to cope also with the cavalry. A cavalry, again, not just of the coming from the steppes, but one that is also something relatively new in the art of war, at least with that degree of toughness, of cohesion. We will talk about it in a minute. And that, in fact, however, can field an outstanding cavalry themselves, right? The most powerful element of the army, however, were the chariot units. Again, this is also normal for sedentary standards at this point. There is, as we've seen, a strong Assyrian influence. There we're talking about the most advanced military in the world at the time. So the Urartians were a bit rougher, but as sedentaries, they had their spearhead, military spearhead in the chariots. Mostly used, of course, with shock charges, especially at this point, because as you know, towards the end of the Bronze Age, you have essentially the chariot system enter a bit in crisis because of the toughness of the infantries of the sea peoples, and so the chariot kept being used, but becoming heavier, not the very agile, shock-absorbed, and speedy wagon used mostly with through a caracole tactics to first pour a very intense arrow fire from the crew on the enemy, and just only finally smashing into the enemy ranks. At this point, chariots. I made videos about not just Bronze Age warfare, but specifically also about Assyrian warfare of this time, the middle, late Assyrian times, to properly try to smash frontally immediately or disorder, right, and not really easily break anymore the enemy, in fact, infantry formation. Cavalry, as we've seen, is gaining ground because it's becoming like the zootechnic equestrian horsemanship capacities are toughening. The more war horses are bred, there are enough that there is enough surplus from these developing powers to maintain large amounts of these animals in certain pastures, like the good ones that exist in the Urartian territory, and that in fact allow such very good cavalry to develop. The science of fortification in this land was also consistently developed, as much as horse breeding, right? We can speak of a feudal society of some sort. Sometimes we think that feudal warfare is, especially, I don't know, in ancient medieval times, there was this kind of reflects a level of tactical, strategic defensivism. This is a great mistake, right? With my modest publications, I'm contributing to dispel this myth, right? As long as you see their powerful fortifications, it's because, first of all, you have somebody that can spend enough to build something larger, because evidently the other fortresses were not enough, right, to withstand the enemy attacks. Horse breeding, in this sense, provides with the shock power. Again, if you have this powerful castles, you also can control wide amount of land where you can again breed these horses. So it's all very refined clientelar system based on also a consistent level of bellicosity within the same Urartian world. These are not, crystal stable systems at all, right? There is always a lot of infighting. In fact, at every time of kind of successory crisis or fragmentation, the steppe peoples from North Caucasus, from the Iranian plateau, pour in again and contribute to, in fact, increase the aforementioned, horsemanship capacity. So it's not just a reaction to the nomads, it's always also the settlement of these people, very often also to strengthen, paradoxically, the same centralization. We've seen it in medieval Europe as well, to have local nobility, sanitary nobility, that fundamentally maintains all these powerful fortresses, and you make some nomads coming under your, say, royal banner, making them locally connected only to you at that point, because they are the only reason why they otherwise wouldn't have any power base, and you can use them to dislodge the nobility from part of these fortresses. You can, for a time, keeping things in check, right, trying not to make this or that noble becoming too powerful, but you need to keep injecting troops. And this is a bit, again, very common thing would continue on. Think about the Mamluks, right? Sometimes the same areas, really. People imported from as far as Russia to serve as slave soldiers in Egypt, and passing a lot from the Caucasus, having even freedmen that want to become bound in that kind of military service. Just add a pinch of Bronze Age, nightmarish brutality to this, in a world where people still believe that there were gods walking among them, as the beautiful, as a terrifying Urartian mythology and artistic representation of it shows us eloquently enough, right? And these are highlands that are difficult to invade, also from other peoples. As we'll see now, the Urartians would be hammered from their northern neighbors mostly, and they would essentially start breaking to the point they asked the Assyrians to take over, to protect them. So they remain a frontier area of this great empire, but gradually losing their own independence and their own kind of political cohesion, at least under this system. Speaking of Urartian armor, we see tied bronze plaques or iron scales sewn onto a soft base of organic material of some sort. We see broad chased bronze girdles, tall bronze or more rarely iron helmets, breastplates, or pectorals. Right, they are pretty simple but effective armor. They also cost a lot in some cases, considering the times, like bronze, especially, and iron, still requiring particularly poor, materially speaking, worlds, an elite, right? Some, again, the aforementioned lords, but not all, right? At least some of their retinues were equipped really neatly, and naturally the tendency was passing from kind of a more tribal background to something more professional, where most people just work the land, and just a select body of troops with the adequate gear would in fact would be prepared to face the enemy in battle. Consider the strategic needs also of moving around this territory to always tame that rebel, that intruder at the outskirts, but also with agitations in within. So it's really a place where you gradually see that even the affirmation of the greater powers is functional to a kind of centralization of resources, with a system that, however, is struggling to maintain a balance, not sclerotized, not to having just too few, right, with too much, and making the whole thing collapse under, again, poor, more primitive people like the nomads, but they are much more morally cohesive and can easily shift the balance internally at their advantage. Now, to their advantage. The Urartians were equipped also with shields of bronze at the heaviest. The majority would probably have wooden shields, or of leather, or osier, right? So this depended on the type of trooper, but just having a wooden shield at the time was a big deal, and there was a substantial training connected with these. Naturally, the bronze ones were mostly for the heroes of the situations, for the elite, and they weighed consistently. They had normally bronze bosses, umbos, which were also still that symbol of status that the more affluent could, even in more modest contexts, could boast, at least. The chargers, especially the chariot horses, were barded. We have seen it even in Mesopotamian warfare, this being quite important, because really horses are quite resistant animals, but they're also quite delicate as far as wounds are concerned. If you are operating a chariot, you need both animals fit, and you can't really make too many changes in the, at least in the in combat. Therefore, you would have some replacements, but you have to come back to your line in order to at least hoping to have something left there. And they're considering that warfare so a lot, as we will see now, of projectiles really flying all around. Horses were some of the biggest targets, and were difficult to protect, if not through this very expensive armor, because it was already for a warrior, being armored was a big deal at the time. Just imagine having the resources for barding your horses. Offensive weapons tell you probably the fierce, aggressive, also very often also a defensive, counter-attacking kind of design panoply. Arrows, maces, bronze battle axes, stone and clay balls for use with slings. Right, so a markedly brutal world, where you see here lots of anti-armor weapon, right? Maces, battle axes, stones, clay balls for use with slings that can, clay has a very high specific weight. It's, it really hurts when you're hit with it, even when you're armored, right? And All these wet arrows, of course, just spicing the whole thing. So all that tells that there is a lot of armor around, at least that warfare is kind of a lordly thing enough for having this elite, right, fighting on chariot that mostly has to come to very close to one another to smash each other's armor, and at the same time, being tempested with a hail of arrows, of other darts and stones and so on, right? Siege warfare, as we've seen, is also quite intense, so stones, javelins are very, very good, and they keep remaining until the ultimate gunpowder will take over, even when very sophisticated weapons came around, because they're really some of the best at close range, especially defending fortifications against armor. And armored troops that are the stormtroopers, really. They are the ones who really dismount from the chariot to go, climbing ladders, storming enemy positions, because they are the only ones who have the protection to withstand, as we've seen, that shower of projectiles, and also the physique, the athleticism, the strength, right, to perform these true stunts, right, that are highly coordinated with other troops, mostly with infantry that shields them and that responds to the enemy fire, trying to suppress the enemy, the enemies on the battlements. We've seen this in, also in Egyptian warfare some months ago, etc. Swords, daggers, spears, as more basic type of weapons, definitely were there, right? We see even battle pitchforks, interestingly enough, and all these weapons were mostly hammered from iron that allowed also a very high degree of standardization, right, which is archaeologically displayed by Urartian weapons, meaning that behind such highest aesthetic and technical criteria of weapons manufacture, there was a substantial degree of centralized arms and armor production, mostly happening within this castles, within the stocks of lords, that redistributed them as either produced them or looted them from their enemies. Again, in the south they had Mesopotamia, and the Urartians really did raid themselves there around, so pillaging the richer place as well, and equipping, as we've seen, their retinues, especially with the finest weapons, right? But evidently there being enough of a demographic agricultural base for a surplus functional to also standardization. The idea that there is a connection between these various centers. It's a real kingdom, right? That counts on different centers that coordinate each other, that can put together substantial forces, and that try to cope with the aforementioned strategic threats that they had to cope with, right? So, in this space, you see that there is hardly a frontier, right? Except the Caucasus in the north, that at least is something more tranchant, geographically speaking. But if you look at the east, right? Like in the first, say we were talking about the early first millennium BC, right? At the areas of Transcaucasia and the Caucasus, you see a more fragmented situation, politically wise. The autochthonous population spoke there a number of languages akin to those spoken at the present still in the area, except the Indo-European and the Turkic ones, right? There is some debate regarding the ancestry of the local dialects, etc. I will not digress on this either, but exclude in this sense Armenian, Ossetian, Tat, and Azerbaijanian, Karachay, Bashkirian, Kulmik, and Nogai, etc. What is left is a trace of the peoples that inhabited this area. So Transcaucasia would be trans from the north, so it's essentially a southeast area towards the Caucasus, but by it we mean even some parts of the north. And this area is quite peculiar because it's somehow diverse, as you understand, climatologically. The Caspian shores are somehow different from, say, the Caucasian foothills, even maybe if they're very close, right? But you have different spaces, different influences, as we'll see now, and so on. But there is a similarity, at least in the political and social profile of these areas, because they are substantially flatlands mostly, and they are fertile enough to maintain, even considering the objectively scarce and primitive level of development locally, nothing like the Urartians, a mosaic of small independent chiefdoms or countries, let's say. So we're talking about dozens of them named by the Urartian texts, right, that were interested in these populations. Why so? Because they were, in their view, these were also sedentaries, right? But they were seen as more barbaric. Those areas were less developed than the ones around the lake band, etc. They were governed by a tribal nobility who occasionally formed coalitions, not very differently to other kind of, you can imagine, Bronze or Iron Age. I mean, I don't know, think about Central Europe, this kind of profile, right? And they naturally estimated their own independence. Mostly the tribal nobility controlled the community, so that was somehow subjected to this aristocracy. But the idea is that these scattered, vast, fertile lands were all in these various nuclei strong enough not to systematically subjugate one another, and their force being, again, demographic and agricultural at the same time, right? It's a place that doesn't develop a kind of an overlordship, not just because it doesn't have resources, but also because these resources are somehow evenly distributed, right? And if you look at these countries, like in terms of broader force, altogether, except the fact that we're politically fragmented, they objectively had a big military and economical potential, right? They also were exposed to as we'll see now, the nomadic threat. They knew how to defend themselves. Their rifle was miserable enough, defending their farms, entrenching themselves, but still, giving their life at a very high cost for the enemies, right? And the nomads there are, again, are aware what the cost of a human being is on the market, economically speaking, and they're wary, because this is a bit like the mix of tribal and relative prosperity that makes it easy, perhaps, to destroy one or two of these countries at a time, but not taking over the entire thing. And especially when you threaten them with this, the result can be all these forces joining and keeping you out, right? This is not a matter of how you fight, whether you are a sedentary farmer or a nomadic herdsman. This has to do with the simply sheer racial forces. So there are ways, of course, for these infantries to defeat the nomads, and that's what happens more often than not at the end of the day. This is not even to say that the Transcaucasians didn't have cavalry on their own. Just as we've seen, they didn't have enough surplus concentrated, like in a feudal society of the Urartian type, to have just one guy, right, that just can afford too much. But everyone can afford enough to be like a good infantryman. Let's put it in this way. It doesn't matter how primitive and poor could be, still what he had was enough, morally and materially, to join forces with others. Transcaucasians became the arms workshop of a vast region as a consequence, right? They wouldn't produce, as we've seen, enough for the local elites to become hyper powerful, but they could altogether produce bronze maces, battle axes, swords, daggers, spears, battle pitchforks that were really a thing, right? As much as their favorite weapons. And as you understand, it's not dramatically different from the arsenal of the average Urartian farmer, right? They're just something slightly less sophisticated, but that can produce this, given the numbers of these people, consistent amount of weapons and selling them somewhere else. Also to the nomads, also to, across the Caspian Sea, even to Mesopotamia, right? If they wanted, say, lots of cheap armor, they could simply draw it from these peoples. There weren't enormous, dramatic trade relations or, export-import traffics or something of this kind. But for the Transcaucasians, it was still a lucrative business. Arrows often had obsidian heads, just hard enough to penetrate a soft armor. So the good enough, most arms and armor, of course, in history is designed within a people to cope with the warriors of the same people, right? So it's basically designed for taking out a Transcaucasian elite that doesn't have much of a heavier armor, right? Mostly, padded one, still organic material of some sort. And these weapons, these arrows, are also nasty enough because they break after piercing the enemy's flesh. So, again, the good enough, right? Maybe not sticking even so deep, with a limited penetration, not a big deal against heavier armor, but there isn't much around anyway. But still, it can create horrendous wounds and make it difficult to extract, and oxidizing the wound enough, exposing to the atmosphere for the bacteria to aggress more and hopefully probably infect irreversibly the wound, right? We've seen the Urartians having bronze or leather or wooden shields. The Transcaucasians had mostly weaker shields, at best covered in leather, right? This is not to say that there wasn't ever in Transcaucasia like the full kind of Bronze Age hero with an ultra-heavy bronze panoply, a war chariot. There were, right? They were rarer than in the other places. In fact, we see girdles of sheet bronze or leather becoming their favorite defensive equipment, because gradually these peoples were civilizing, as we have seen, with one another. They could export larger, say, imagine this Transcaucasian aristocracy controlling a bit the local market and selling maybe lots of the simpler weapons and getting in exchange maybe just a few, but some quite updated arms and armor from, say, the Urartians. And going with that, we find metal plates of different dimensions sewn to leather armor. So they had their heavies, of course. They weren't skirmishers or anything. No, they were their tribal. They had their tribal communal militias of some sort. Bronze helmets are found, and they are similar to the ones manufactured in Asia Minor, which tells us that these were likely imports, even though they were in part also produced locally. And we find them just occasionally, to prove again that the average warrior was not so affluent, for affording a better protection. The Transcaucasian warriors fought mainly on foot. As a consequence, cavalry and chariot were employed, but their use was paradoxically more shock-oriented. Why? You would think they had lighter troops on average, they could have been more of the skirmishing type. Well, the fact is that in order to have kind of lights, you must have some, and they probably had in the form of cavalry already. In fact, it would have been interesting to measure the segmentation, say the proportions between war chariots, war horses at this point fielded compared, say, between the Urartians, the Transcaucasians, etc. And the latter, however, say if you had lighter troops, this had necessarily to to be functional, as we've seen, in order to a shock element as well. So something heavier, right? Given that there wasn't much of a guy that could own a horse normally in these areas, right? They would use mounted troops only basically to support the infantry in some way. So if you had to have chariots or the same horses, it would be more effective just to have a punching effect than a back and forth one that requires still a lot of training, a lot of lifestyle probably in a nomadic context, or at least one that, as we've seen, has a lot of surplus, like in Mesopotamia, for the local powers to emulate some good level of horsemanship from the steppe world. Instead, here you are rougher. You're just this peasantry force that want to shock, that overwhelms the enemy with a packed charge. And before that, you may want to send some chariots smashing into the enemy lines, or with horses, and then following with the infantry. It makes more sense than trying simply to soften up the guys, making back and forth, and especially exposing, because this was the deal, your basic forces as footmen to a prolonged enemy fire. You wanted to close distances more quickly, because as we've seen, they didn't have much of an armor. They didn't even count themselves on having substantial missile capacity. They would prefer just to launch everything they had against the enemy and overwhelming them with sheer muscular mass, right? Which tells a lot about also the psychological profile of these people. The last one we discuss here that intertwines in both history are the Cimmerians. The Cimmerians are an Iranian people, however, basically akin to the Scythians, but still considered outside of their group. Right, they were basically the same thing, and they would be dislodged historically from their land by the same Scythians, in fact, dwelling in the steppes of north of the Pontic area up to the Aral Sea. Right, so they're a bit, again, the predecessors of all the waves of other Iranian peoples that would come later, always from the east, replacing the others, as we explained in the video about the Sarmatians, at different waves for millennia, practically. These were, again, Iranian-speaking nomadic tribes of cattle and horse breeders as well. They were the most advanced equestrian force you could find at the time. In fact, in the early first millennium BC, they became the first people to put mounted archers into the field. Anecdotally, right? Surely they weren't the very first. Here we're talking, however, about a collective force that makes sense in the art of war, stemming, as we will see now, naturally from the nomadic lifestyle of these herdsmen, the fact they just hunted and ruled with this compact groups of cavalrymen on quite extended territory, mostly again populated by semi-nomads. That also, as the name says, they're not literally just completely nomad. I mean, it's very difficult to say what a full nomad is. Like a full nomad would be somebody constantly moving, never stopping. Right? At some point they did stop. They moved from place to place, and there were other kind of semi-sedentary, we can say, populations in the same area over whom they ruled. It's not that simple to create a mounted archery force just out of nothing, right? It requires this intensive, in fact, equestrian lifestyle, the coalition of significant political forces. There is an advantage naturally in nomadism as much as this hit and run strategies and tactics are concerned, which reflects, however, still some limit accordingly, because one thing is facing these guys in open field, which can be very risky because they rely on also encirclement, outflanking, and so on. But there isn't so much that these peoples can do in front of a fortress, if not succeeding in raising it to the ground, but eventually having to mostly abandon it. Naturally, there were some sort of semi-permanent fortresses also in the nomadic world, but they were more functional to, some kind of not much land defense, but say given enough time for the people to get ready, and if necessary also maybe letting the enemy in, carrying out a scorched earth strategy until he was softened up enough to be attacked, in fact, in open field, because also in open field, normally the sedentaries had the upper hand against the nomads. So everything was also more politically fragmented there, at least in terms of what happened when these people came back home. Mostly, however, they were pressured by the environmental conditions to carry out habitually some raids by coalescing different groups and developing such collective training, discipline, kind of order that is really required for a mounted force. Right. So here we are in the times in which mounted archery develops quite interesting things. Imagine, that horse archers shoot in the moment in which all four for the hooves of the horse are literally above ground, right? Because when they're hitting the ground, the shot could be destabilized. So they would choose that exact moment. They would feel it. They would spend their lifetime on horseback. There would be brutal massacres without any trace of human mercy. As you will see, they had, of course, their heavy elements too. In fact, some of the tribes in the steppes of northern Ciscaucasia came into contact with the local Proto-Adeg tribes that are a people still existing in southwestern Russia, just north of the Caucasus on the Black Sea, that descends, at least from these groups, with great approximations, and that at the time were outstanding metallurgists who produced not only bronze weapons and ornaments, but iron blades as well. The locals had the metals, the craftsmanship. Giving these weapons in the hands of the nomads was really a thing, right? These would pay substantially because they wouldn't just loot and raid and pillage. Sometimes would do that, massacring, raping, enslaving and whatever. But they would also have peaceful relations. The nomads would have their exports and so on. They would also partly acquire such techniques. But such weapons were very prized in the steppes, especially where you have a very narrow, numerically, but very tough elite that can afford them, really embodying the superior tribes that rule over the others in the harsh law of the steppes. In the 8th century BC, hosts of these mounted archers poured through the mountain passes of the Caucasus into, in fact, Transcaucasia and further to the Near East, Asia Minor, and northern Mesopotamia. This would become a regular habit, right? The one of essentially these peoples, later the Scythians, etc., just carrying out this massive raids that couldn't quite be stopped, right? Again, for logistical needs, mainly the forage of the horses that were many and consumed lots of of grass locally, required them to move very fast, right? A bit like Napoleonic armies that they bailed out from logistics entirely from the force of the 18th century, because they would have just to move. They were such a crushing force, such a punching one, such one that you could also have difficulty to chase in case they were in inferiority, right? And that could always rely on this tactics of making you, attracting you somewhere just as a bait, and then falling on you when you were at your weakest, and carrying out this nerve-wracking kind of hit-and-run tactics in this, kind of semi-desertic space, raising clouds of dust, never knowing how many other of them would be next, right? It could be the entire freaking army, the shock element that may have been instead tens of kilometers away and just, wearing you out. And maybe catching you by surprise when you had lowered guard out of just resignation or just exhaustion. And with enormous loot, which sometimes the sentries would manage to recover by ambushing, especially through the mountain passes, some of these very peoples at their return, especially this more brutal populations of the frontier, were more just closer to home, and say also more acquainted with the strategy, the vital strategy connected to the control of those passes. In any case, they were a real plague for the Senatries, and really coming to bring on horseback the art of war on another level, because chariots would grow to be fundamentally inadequate against these peoples. Would have been better to have had tougher infantry rather than the chariots that were too unwieldy. They couldn't quite compete just with the cavalry now anymore, and especially with enemies that carried out what be known from the name of another Iranian people, the Parthian shot. In fact, so offending even when retreating, not just a sign of utter superiority. If you retreat, it's because they cannot smash on the enemy, but still causing vicious losses in sometimes in conclusive engagements that, however, wore out lots of your resources and were a no-win for anyone involved. Hence also the practice sometimes of letting these peoples pass and by across your territory by negotiating at least a contained level of pillaging, just because they were heading somewhere else where they thought they would find the greater riches. Because the idea is that the more the more precious what you loot is the smallest weight and volume it has, right? So it's not just collecting everything, right? But collecting very rich stuff that could be used by their warlords to again gather other clienteles and becoming ever more powerful and hopefully centralizing the minimum on a local basis in the Pontic steppes. It's at this point that such Iranian peoples of from that region would be known as Cimmerians. Consider that in the Georgian language, the fame of these people and their exploits has survived by associating the word Gemiri, so Cimmerians basically, to the name of giant. Right, that's how they were called. Also because they were objectively tougher, they were selected in a much more radically and traumatically brutal reality that not even, these other sedentary peoples in Bronze Age really knew. So they were tougher, they had to be more agile, more robust. You don't survive a lifetime on horseback, even if you're lucky not to be scalped during your first expedition, your first raid that you actually carry out to scalp other people in the process. So it can get very interesting, and these people were really tough, right, and big, and robust, resistant, and as we were saying before, quite psychiatrically, not even psychologically, interesting for what they had to go through in order to participate in this raid. Right, these are the early, these are war bands fundamentally that require a vicious selection that regularly takes out a substantial amount of those who even want to enter before even beginning to be just in the last echelon of the retinue of the warlord that is a god, and to whom we are devoted, by the way, and that there is all, again, a fascinating mythological background behind this, but it's something sometimes you literally do not want to know. As we've seen, the Cimmerians essentially had in mind a different type of battle order that utterly surprised the enemy. Aside from the general weakness, as we've seen, of the nomads, definitely what was happening in Mesopotamia, also the decline of the Assyrians, the kind of the change again, especially of the war chariot supremacy, the spread of other peoples from even similar areas, right? Because we're talking about the Indo-Europeans, also in other areas of Europe, the Mediterranean, had sensibly weakened civilization for these guys to take advantage of that, right? So mostly their exploits were connected with the weakness of the sanitaries more than any specific political or strategic virtue. But as hungry as they were in the steppe, they also were quite quick to take advantage of the situation. The peoples of the Near East were also, eager to adopt the achievements of the Cimmerians, right? Cavalry, as we've seen, was increasing in importance also in their armies. These nomads were hired regularly as mercenaries here and there. So their equestrian capacity was very much in vogue at the time. The light bridle and the soft saddle, for example. The small, tight bow and arrows with superior ballistic characteristics. Well, they all began at this point to enter the civilized world as a legacy of the steppes. Naturally, besides bows and arrows, as we said, the Cimmerians used iron daggers and, albeit quite rarely, this is important, swords. Part of the reason really being the primitiveness of their warfare. I mean, daggers were used just in the unfortunate chance in which the majority of, like the average trooper, let's say, found himself practically unarmored to cope with an enemy. Right, daggers, their favorite weapon would be, as we've seen, bows and arrows that were mostly effective against other unarmored opponents. Then they had, as we'll see now, spears, lassos, javelins, by the way. So daggers were a bit useful, right? The basics, like the minimal weapon, even for less affluent warriors to, even in theory, taking on an armored opponent in a way or another, which could always occur. Swords were really very, very expensive in the first place, and that's why these nomads sometimes didn't literally have enough surplus, and that's why they were nomads. This is what I would like to make you understand. Even compared to the Transcaucasians, whatever, these were savages, were primitives, were something unspeakable, right? As we were saying, the Cimmerians fought with spears, bronze Caucasian battle axes, stone maces, and picks. So warhammers basically would take every kind of weapon available. Especially the latter was an archaic legacy of their early ancestors, documenting in this case an anti-armor capacity, which was definitely used against the heavier enemies of the sanitary areas, that however they preferred not to find themselves in the condition of having to fight against in hand-to-hand combat, but also against themselves, right? The ultra elite, so the one that is also more likely to have left archaeological evidence of themselves, were meant to fight by definition against the elite to prove their superiority. Also, their mythologies talk about these men covered in metal, right? This kind of demi-gods, heroes, essentially making this great stunt of evolving from a mineral into pure spirit, or at least probably a divine nature in heaven. And of course all their horsemanship was a metaphor that the necessity of unleashing this chthonic blood and dirt of the horse to elevate the knight, to tame the animal. This chthonic force is elevating, transfiguring the guy to heaven. Just think about riding across the Ukrainian steppe in the first millennium BC and looking just at the sky, at how blue the sky of millennia ago could be, right? And that's where, again, all these peoples drew their meaning, right? The fact that they were descending from a heavenly god, and that the stars themselves were just the mark of heroes that entered the firmament after their death. So there is, again, a worldview we cannot properly replicate. But again, the idea of smashing somebody's brain by sticking this kind of picks in an enemy's skull, penetrating the helmet, was one of the first cute concerns of a Cimmerian horseman, and they highlighted the bravery of having come too close to an armored enemy, mostly because you would have you were armored enough to take him on. But sometimes also, especially as a youth that had to enter those kind of perverse initiatory rites without which you couldn't really start from, you have to have the guts to essentially approach the enemy without any armor on, just doing, maybe not killing him, but hopefully, or at least doing something like pulling his horse's tail or something, and so on, right? Very often also your wife, that in the female side, that is surely not designed, even in the steppes, aside from the Amazonic myths of the Greek, etc., to be a warrior, also lives in a traumatically violent reality to be required to have severed an enemy's head before losing her virginity. Which, if you're trying to, search for, warmth and understanding from a Cimmerian woman, just, bear in mind that she has, at least as some person of status, severed somebody's head, which may be a problem in case you have an argument, a marital argument, in your everyday Cimmerian life, sentimental life. So this is again, I cannot stress this enough. Sometimes you think these are hyperbole. They're actually not, right? It's just that we have substantially removed the mere meaning of why they would do that, which is also something that you have to explain. Today we can't do that on the grounds of religion or anthropology, but it makes a lot of sense for those people. Not because it's them, not in terms of moral relativism, but because we're all human, and there is only one standard for everyone, right? And there are the better and the worse, and they cared a big deal, because being worse could make the difference between a life and death. Not just for you, but for all the others. There couldn't be weak people in the group, because that seriously compromised, endangered, threatened the order of the entire system. So that's why they had to be brutalized in order to even do anything in the first place. They had to literally be born again in somebody's blood, to be called with other names, to be other people, right? As far as the defensive arms of a Cimmerian, we can see, except for shields of wood and leather, that already show a greater heaviness, a more violent reality than, say, an average Transcaucasian farmer. Were almost never used, though, right? They had some armor, right? The noblest warriors occasionally at least wore some, imported mostly from beyond the Caucasus. Not only, as we have seen, there were this cis-Caucasian peoples that occasionally had pretty good metallurgy, and these peoples would essentially adopt it quickly themselves. But again, it cost a lot, right? They had the technology, they had the know-how, they know how to produce, but the surplus was often not enough. That's why they raided around, because literally locally they didn't have a better way to live like. So the Cimmerians, as other Iranian peoples in the western Eurasian steppes, were to pass right to the north in the steppes of Ciscaucasia. The Scythians were gathering and would fundamentally overwhelm them. So we will see those on another occasion. For today, I was just glad to discuss this reality. Again, I don't know how graphic, concrete, and effective I was in trying at least to present introductively what these peoples were about. We'll probably be more poignant and precise, and also documented in, again, the more specialized videos that I was talking about. In any case, at least the times, the places, the peoples here, have you ever reflected on the early first millennium BC Transcaucasians? I don't know. Nor that you're specifically required, but that makes you think, which is a bit the purpose of this all. For today, in fact, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.